going to be a deluge within the judiciary very soon. 6 out of the 7 Supreme Court judges facing some very serious allegations ranging from corruption, abuse of office, gross misconduct. So where do we begin? What is going on within the judiciary, Jamila?
I think we need to go into specifics because let's start in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Yesterday we had the Chief Justice and the Judicial Service Commission resolving to ask the President to actually form a tribunal to investigate the conduct of Supreme Court Judge Jackton Ojwang. Now, why? It follows allegations of close associations with Migori County and its governor, Okoth Obado. One of the complaints against the judge is that he authored a judgment with respect to the Sony Sugar Belt. And in return, he was rewarded by Governor Obado, who allegedly built a road to the private residence of the Supreme Court judge in the outskirts of Migori. Now, there are also allegations, including being bribed to deliver favorable rulings and being a partial arbitrator. Now, the JSC said that because of the accusations against the judge, it saw that there was reasonable ground to warrant the formation of a tribunal. But we need to remember that the judge refused to appear before the JSC. In fact, he had even asked for his lawyers to go before the JSC, and he felt that he should not appear before the JSC at all. But that's why they took this action after investigations, because this is not the only complaint they received. I think they received complaints from almost 32 or more judges.
And Jackton Ojwang himself is involved in another petition with 3 of his fellow judges.
With Jokin Dungu and the Smoking Wanjala.
Yes, and Justice Ibrahim as well.
Ibrahim,
and this is regarding that case against the Wajir governor, which, they upheld his election despite the fact that the High Court and the Appellate Court had raised serious issues. Number one, with the fact that the governor did not have a degree and therefore did not qualify in the first place.
Yes.
But then they also raised issues with how the IEBC conducted the election, saying there were irregularities, it was not a free and fair process, and then went on to further indict the Wajir governor himself, saying there were allegations of bribery that he had engaged in. This is what is interesting about that, because I'd like us to just talk about that judgment a little bit. It is very interesting that then the Supreme Court came and said that, listen, even if he does not have a degree, but he behaves in a manner in which a person with a degree would. And what is interesting is that is what they latched on, but they did not really speak about what the High Court and the Appellate Court had raised, which were issues with the IEBC, which meant that even if you were to say he didn't have a degree but behaves as if he has one, why did the Supreme Court not touch on the fact that IEBC had serious irregularities as made by the High Court and the Appellate Court in their ruling? So some say some of the decisions that were made by the Supreme Court judges are suspect to say the least.
In fact, the 4 judges, because it was a majority rule.
Yes.
It was only the Chief Justice and Justice Lenaola who ruled against it. The other 4, Mohammed Ibrahim, Professor Ojwang, Smoking Wanjala and Jokin Dungu, faulted the High Court and the Appellate Court for assuming a jurisdiction they do not have. That's what it says. The judges said the degree issue was a pre-election matter and should have been addressed by a dispute committee at the IEBC or by the Political Parties Disputes Tribunal. So it should not have been a matter that was brought before
But if
court.
they find that he did not qualify in the first place,
in my view, the court and the judges can give us as many as 1,000 reasons as to how they reached their decision, and we will not get a conclusive answer. They'll always have a reason as to why they made that decision. But going to the events that are going on around the Supreme Court, what we can conclude at this stage is that between now and 2022, there'll be at least between 4 and 6 vacancies at the Supreme Court. It is a 7-judge bench, but 6 of them are facing questions. In the cases, Jamila, you've pointed out, there is a petition involving 4. There is one for Jackton Ojwang, and of course there is one against the CJ, and another against the deputy CJ. She's in court. So basically what we are witnessing is the beginning of what may be a huge shakeup of the Supreme Court.
I look at this at it this way, Joe. There was a lot of hope in the Supreme Court. Actually, if you're dealt with badly at the Magistrates Court, at the High Court, at the Court of Appeal, you have solace in the Supreme Court. So I think in terms of integrity, professionalism, efficiency, prudence, it should be at the top at the Supreme Court. Look at the number of elections that were nullified by the High Court and the Court of Appeal. But when the matters went to the Supreme Court, the situation changed. It should tell you something. And when you hear that money exchanged hands in hundreds of millions, we may not have the tangible evidence, but this is the scenario where there is smoke. There ought probably to be some fire. But even as we speak about the judges, we must also speak about the lawyers who represent various people at the Supreme Court. When you hear serious allegations of bribery against the judges, the question is, did the litigants take the bribes to the judges? Or did they use lawyers to take the money to the judges? So we need a fuller discussion on this question, but there is probably need to look at it more intensely. The Chief Justice is also facing a petition. Yesterday in that press conference, they said every judge has been mentioned. There are about 14 of them. They have 14 days to present responses to the petitions. I highly doubt the Judicial Service Commission is going to rule that the President forms a tribunal to remove the Chief Justice. Highly unlikely. But
but a number of the petitions that have come before
Supreme Court judges, I suspect something will happen there.
I think Linus alluded to something that I think is worthy of note at this point. We are just a few years before the next election. And the nature of a presidential election, because remember the Supreme Court has the original jurisdiction with regard to
original and final.
With regard to presidential petitions. And if we are this 3 or 4 years to an election, and you see this kind of thing happening in the Supreme Court, it is also possible not to rule out the political hand, because there is anyone who has any interest, and there are many people who have interest in presidential elections, either people who are running or people who are kingmakers and that sort of thing. They will be monitoring what is happening there very, very keenly, if not outrightly trying to engineer whatever shakeup, so that they can have a say in what happens in the reorganization that might ensue. So in my view, the political question really would be important. Remember, there is the president will be forming a tribunal, and he has to form. That is what is expected. He doesn't have a choice about it. But he still has a say. He still can decide whether Jackson Ojwang remains or not. Theoretically, you would expect him to form a tribunal that basically will follow the rules, follow the evidence, and make an objective call. But he is a politician. He could also form a tribunal that basically says...
would either absolve him or...
depending on whether he wants Ojwang to stay or not.
Right.
But there's a sense in which the politics of the day and the politics of 2022 will determine what happens in the end.
And I'd like to just pick up on that, because politicians, as we say, might have a stake. But what is interesting in terms of many of these allegations that are being made in the petitions to the JSC is that they're being made by senior counsel, senior lawyers.
But also look about the timing. I mean, all of them, almost all of them have come within the last 2 weeks.
Right.
Or so.
Yes.
For me, quite interesting.
And what is interesting for me is that, the judges are supposed to be sacrosanct. Their decisions are supposed to be binding. They're supposed to get the respect. And with certain allegations like these being made, whether or not there's a political hand, and there very well may be, but it's being made by senior counsel. Does this stand the risk of bastardizing the courts to the point that when we get to 2022, their decisions are not binding, we don't trust them, we do not believe them? That could very well be.
That could be the point.
But there is, it very well could be. But that is what is key for me, is that we're getting to the point where, and somebody was talking about the CJ now having perhaps to have a proper communication, because we see the CJ defending when is he the president of the Supreme Court? When is he a member of the JSC? When is he defending the judiciary and the Supreme Court, because it's coming under attack to the point
But when you look at you talk about those the senior counsel and all of these things, remember a lot of allegations have always been that anytime a judge is going to be bribed, there has to be a lawyer somewhere in the mix.
Right.
Yes.
And not a small one.
High profile.
And in a situation where you're talking about up to 61 judges facing various petitions, cases of whatever sort, and 75 magistrates, it tells you that if the theory is true that the lawyers are involved, we are talking about...
In fact, right
there
now...
are some lawyers who are talking about certain communication that they might have had with the judges. And it begs the question, if you are a senior counsel going before Judge Joe Ageo, and you are texting and sending messages and sending WhatsApp to this very person who is determining your case, then there is a problem.
Because if you look at it this way, Joe is talking about the number of judges who are in trouble right now. And as it stands right now, the JSC is hearing complaints against the 11 judges. We've talked about the Supreme Court judges, but also judges from the Court of Appeal and High Court judges. In fact, one of them is the representative of the Court of Appeal on JSC, and that's Judge Mohamed Warsame. A petition was filed before the JSC on Tuesday by a gentleman called Wardere Bule, who alleged that Justice Warsame has breached the judicial code of conduct through acts he considers as gross. I don't know what he means by gross.
Actually, he was saying, the petitioner is saying that Judge Warsame, or he's alleging that Judge Warsame is the conduit of bribery within the Court of Appeal. In fact, even citing a figure, 72 million. Those are some of the things that he's expected to respond to within 14 days. But more fundamentally, let us look at what has been happening in the composition of the Judicial Service Commission. That's happened not so long ago. I mean, look at the appointments that were made there. It gives you a window to what could be the likely politics, as Joe and Linus are talking about, in terms of the composition of the Supreme Court ahead of 2022. We will have 2 vacancies, at least a minimum of 2 vacancies, because remember, Justice Ojwang is retiring next year.
And so
the Chief Justice is also retiring. So at least you have 2 vacancies clearly and absolutely by 2022. So if there is any other judge that is of the Supreme Court that is likely to fall by the wayside before then that increases the number of vacancies there. And so it also increases the amount of politics around it, because obviously it is in the interest of all the players in the 2022 race to have a Supreme Court that probably will.
And remember, either way, the CJ will not be there because he has to retire in 2021.
Right.
So it means the race is on there, and if what is happening to the deputy actually matures into something that gets her out of office, then you really have like a completely what they usually call an open race.
I think it will be a tragedy if the composition of the Supreme Court will have to be pegged on the 2022 election. It'll be a terrible message about the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary, and the future function of the judiciary. Already we have these questions about the JSC. JSC is increasingly looking like a partisan political body out to carry out certain assignments. This is not good for the country. I know the president and former prime minister keep talking about building bridges and inclusivity and all that. If institutions such as the judiciary are now going to be angled around the political divides that we have in this country, so that we now know that in the Supreme Court there is a majority of judges that can rule a certain way, this is a tragedy for the country.
But wasn't that there even before?
Flashpoint.
It has always been
because
the case.
now,
Been the case, Not
really. This court really acquitted itself through the presidential petition. It gave a semblance of, you can do that.
Yes.
Did you just nullify an election?
It was an
Not
accident.
once.
But for the first time in the country, for the first time in Africa, it actually gave them an impression of, that was unlikely. So, if the reverse happens, which is to take away all that and then create a court whose decisions will be predictable. We've seen also some questionable transfers, for example. Some judges that were seen as quite independent, based at Milimani, now moving to places like Machakos and places like Kajiado. And then what those perceived as pro-regime judges being posted to Nairobi. This is a disaster waiting to happen.
But did that not seem like the CJ himself was then bowing to pressure? Because a lot of those movements were made even after that anti-corruption conference where, both the president, even the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, going in hard.
I think at some point the CJ crumbled.
Yeah.
The CJ.
That was what I was going to ask.
So I think what Linus is saying is absolutely true, but it is also going to be unusual for us to expect that there will be no attempts to influence the reconstitution of the Supreme Court ahead of 2022.
Right.
The only question is whether those attempts will be successful.
The question also is, these judges, if there are vacancies at the Supreme Court, it is the responsibility of the Judicial Service Commission to appoint the replacements. And this is where the Judicial Service Commission comes in. So it starts at the Constitution of the Judicial
JC,
Service Commission.
yes.
If you have the numbers there,
Yeah.
then you'll also have the numbers at the Supreme Court. So that generally should help us look at the two. I mean, it's more of a symbiotic kind of a situation. If you have the numbers here, you will end up with the numbers there.
But I should also
you'll
just
end up with the
mention-
decision.
Lawyer
Yes.
Mudomzi Yankolu doesn't have very kind words. He says the Supreme Court is a scum of monumental